The Dust Bowl during the Great Depression was 3,000 times worse than we were ever taught in school. It was so bad that a new mental illness was discovered called dust madness, where women were roaming the streets, literally walking in circles, talking to themselves. A new actual physical illness was discovered called dust pneumonia, which mainly affected children and the elderly, especially babies, where your lungs were literally filled with dirt, because we call it the Dust Bowl. It was very fine dirt, hence dust, but it was dirt in your lungs, killing thousands every month. Now, this lasted from 1932 all the way until 1939. So 7 years of dust hell. And 2/3 of the population in the Dust Bowl did not leave during this time. And now you're going to ask, why? Why not leave? Well, number one, it's the Great Depression, and people literally have pennies to their name, if that. It costs money to leave. Number two, they knew if they did leave, they would just go to the city where they didn't know anyone and unemployment rates were above 25%. They knew people were starving in the city as well. Number three, you physically could not leave after a certain amount of time. About 2 years into these storms happening, they got so bad, visibility would be 1 foot. How do you expect someone to drive a car in those sorts of conditions? Not only that, but these cars would hit these dunes because roads, they were dirt paths and you could not see when you were driving on them. And these dunes of dirt would form. And these cars, when they hit the dunes, would tip over. They were quite literally stranded. And if you're thinking, okay, then hop on a train. Well, it derailed trains too. Not only could you not see well enough to drive a car, but these storms caused static electricity that was so bad that if you made skin-to-skin contact with someone, you oftentimes would be knocked on your ass as if you just touched a live wire. That's how strong the currents were. And these currents would cause the cars to not be able to start or to stall out. So even if they're on, they would completely stall. The static electricity was so bad that a barbed wire fence would glow blue because of the current running through it. If you were trying to grow any sort of fruits or vegetables, like a watermelon vine is the example they used, the static electricity would quite literally singe the plant to death, and you would wake up and your plant would be burnt to a crisp. Now, these storms would come on so fast that 1 minute you would be looking at a clear blue sky in the field, and 30 seconds later, you would be in a storm where you're disoriented because you can't see anything. So what you thought was north is now south, and you would literally get lost in the dust. And if you get lost in the dust, you would often die of suffocation. You would often, if you didn't die, go blind from the dirt getting into your eye sockets. It was impossible to keep your house free of dust. You had to hold a towel over your mouth during these storms inside of your home to be able to breathe. Your home would often be buried in the dust dirt because it would gather where it's stopped by the wind. So oftentimes driving down the road, you would just be able to see the chimney of a house. Tumbleweeds accentuated this problem because tumbleweeds gathered together. And by gathering together, they formed a structure for this dirt to form dunes all over the place, sometimes 40 feet high. Tumbleweeds are an invasive species brought here probably by Volga Germans who were living in Russia, according to this book. And they were not meant to be brought here. They were probably in clothing or in other seeds that the Volga Germans brought with them, like wheat. And they just absolutely took off in the Dust Bowl and became a massive problem during this time specifically. Not only was the dust just constantly in your home, but this caused the bugs to act very strangely. There was no longer any safe spaces to hide in the Dust Bowl. Therefore, they started coming in homes in droves. And we're talking centipedes, black widows, tarantulas. Several people died of black widow bites because their homes were absolutely infested with insects. This is one of the weirder facts that I did not know about the Dust Bowl, but people in cities had their own problems at the time. They didn't really believe that the Dust Bowl was happening or that it was as bad as what was being reported until 1935. So 3 years after these storms started happening, one day in all of the metropolitan cities, Chicago, New York, DC, Baltimore, Philadelphia, everyone woke up and everything was covered in dirt. It went so far as 200 miles out to sea and hit ships that were out there. These storms lasted 4 days in these major metropolitan cities. And finally, people were like, okay, I guess the Dust Bowl is happening. What can we do about it? Coincidentally, FDR, when this storm hit DC, was in a meeting about the drought that was happening in the Great Plains, which immediately upon entering office, he knew was a huge problem. He was not ignoring it. He believed it. He knew it was a huge issue that had to be dealt with immediately. But he was in a meeting where other people weren't convinced, and he was like, well, here's the evidence. Look outside. Look around you. Another thing I didn't know is one of the first policies he implemented in the Great Plains. FDR sent government workers out to the Great Plains to purchase all of the livestock that was still alive on the plains. Cows were already starving, blind, filled with sores all over their bodies. Cows, horses, pigs, chickens. His first move was to send government workers out there and to kill all of the animals. He quite literally sent people door to door saying, hey, you've got 18 cows. 2 of them are good enough to still go to slaughter. The other 16 of them need to be killed. We're going to shoot them today. We are going to pay you for these animals, $5 for the good ones that are going to go to slaughter, $1 for everyone that we need to shoot and kill today. And honestly, these farmers knew it because these farmers cared about these animals and were devastated seeing what they were having to go through. They were so broke that $1 was something that they simply couldn't turn down. He also trusted a soil scientist to implement change in the Great Plains. His name was Hugh Bennett, and Hugh's soil conservation program is the only remaining program left from FDR's New Deal. I learned all of this in The Worst Hard Time by Timothy Egan. 5-star read, absolutely loved it. I had nightmares from this book. I had no idea the Dust Bowl was as bad as it was. There were people in this book who had gone through the 1918 flu, been soldiers in World War I and World War II, and they still said nothing was ever worse than experiencing the dust storms, which they referred to as dusters. One of the huge things I didn't mention was something that happened in 1937. So that's 5 years after these storms started happening. There was an unusually clear day, and one young boy goes out into the field and says, "Wow, it's really clear out today. Maybe this whole thing is over." And he starts to get some chores done in the yard because you couldn't really work outside when these storms were happening. And he starts to hear this buzzing noise. And he's like, shoot, another duster's coming. That must be the static electricity. He's looking all around. He can't really see anything. And then he starts to see this cloud in the distance, but he's used to what these dust storms look like by now. And this one looks different to him. He goes inside to get his dad, and his dad's an old-timey cowboy. So he's been on this land for a long, long time. And his dad's looking in the distance, and he's listening, and he goes, "That's not a duster. Those are grasshoppers." A plague of locusts hits the Dust Bowl 5 years after these storms started happening, as if these poor folks are not suffering enough. The drought did strange things to the locust population. One, it killed all the birds and the snakes that typically eat these locusts. Two, there's a special type of fungus that typically kills a lot of the larvae, but it happens during wet season, which hasn't been happening now for 5 years. The locusts swarm this boy and his father and the rest of the Dust Bowl so heavily that they start to eat the clothing off of his father. They start to eat the homes that they're living in. Now, at this point, Hugh Bennett had been really encouraging, via FDR's funding, people to plant grass in these lands. Stop planting corn, stop planting wheat, plant grass. This is grassland. And they had some success, including this family. They had planted some grass and it had grown. In about 15 seconds, these locusts ate every single blade of grass within viewing distance. In one of the counties, an agricultural leader, Bill Baker, estimated that there were 23,000 locusts per acre, so 14 million per square mile. This problem became so bad they had to call in the National Guard. However, the National Guard, along with the U.S. government's solution for these grasshoppers, was to poison them. And what did they use to poison them? Arsenic. Do I need to explain why that's not a good idea in their current circumstances, or really in any circumstance? Well, funny you should say that. It is the government's fault, almost entirely. Number one, the killing of the buffalo. Now, this is something that white people kind of took upon themselves to do in the plains, and then it became a government initiative. In Kansas alone, the bones of 31 million buffalo were sold between 1868 and 1881. We removed an essential part of the plains ecosystem, which now we understand with science, when you disrupt one part of an ecosystem, you disrupt it all. Without them, everything was off balance. Number two, the government removed the indigenous populations of the Great Plains and sent them to reservations elsewhere, mainly the Comanche, Apache, Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Western Sioux. Again, this indigenous population had been part of this land for tens of thousands of years. They are part of the ecosystem, and the government removed yet another essential part of the Great Plains by doing this. The indigenous population cared for that land and understood it better than anyone else. Number three, during World War I, Herbert Hoover was the head of the U.S. Food Administration, and he started the campaign that wheat would win the war. Was he right about that? Yeah, kind of. He set the price for wheat bundles at $2 a bundle, which was a lot of money then. This caused a ton of people who were not farmers to go search for land that was available to farm wheat. Hordes of people came out to the Great Plains looking for available land. Number four, a new type of plow was invented, that being a plow pulled by a tractor. This tractor dug super deep into the soil and ripped up the roots of the grass. And in this grassland, the roots were essential for next year's growing of the grass. The plains grass was also essential because it kept moisture for about a foot underground. It was like a sponge in the root system. So even during a drought, you could dig into the soil and it would be wet because those grass roots acted like a sponge. This invasive plowing technique completely tore everything up. Now, most of the people who moved out there were looking to homestead, meaning they wanted to stay on that land and make it their lifestyle. But there was also a large portion of what this author referred to as suitcase farmers. And the suitcase farmers were really what screwed everything up, because they planted wheat for 2 or 3 years, so 2 or 3 seasons of farming, ripped up all the wheat, sold it, replanted nothing in its place, leaving the topsoil exposed with nothing planted to hold it down, and then took off back to the city where they came from. This created a perfect storm. A drought hit in 1932. The winds on the plains have always been high, but the grassroots keep the topsoil to the ground. Without the grassroots, and with this invasive plowing technique, the winds just picked up the topsoil and blew it all over the country for 7 years. I see a lot of people in the comments saying, oh, crop rotation fixed it. Crop rotation is the cause. Crop rotation is not the cause of what blew the dust everywhere, or the lack of crop rotation, that is. Nothing but grass was meant to grow in this place. Still to this day, nothing but grass is meant to grow there. Not trees, not wheat, not corn. You're supposed to be able to look left to right on the plains and see nothing but grass. That's what it was for tens of thousands of years before it was colonized. Now, as if this isn't bad enough, one of FDR's thoughts on how do we fix this, because FDR did not cause this problem. Hoover and the presidents before him caused this problem. But one of the solutions he came up with was, what if we invite the indigenous populations back? Now, how is that fair? It's been destroyed. You've killed all the buffalo, and now you ask them to fix what you have destroyed. Well, not him, but you know what I'm saying, the government. He pitched this several times, and I do think partially it was because he knew it was wrong that they were removed. This plan never came to fruition. The indigenous population also kind of knew that even if they did go to fix the land, once it was healthy again, it would be ripped from them again, because they had been lied to over and over and over again by this government. No amount of planting trees helped the situation. No amount of crop rotation helped this situation. The only thing that helped this situation was Hugh Bennett's plan to replant grass throughout the grasslands. I actually did not know that buffalo are pollinators, but that makes sense because their fur can grow up to 20 inches in the fall for winter, so they're much fluffier than cows. Buffalo are also significantly heavier than cattle. If you've ever seen one in person, they are the size of a car or a truck even. They're huge. So their heavy footprints would cause these indentations in the grass, and rain would puddle in these indentations. These little puddles were essential for holding rain in an area that didn't get very much rain. The buffalo were also perfectly suited to live in this area. Shocker, as they've been here for millennia. Cattle are not, and they are an extremely sensitive animal. Buffalo can withstand temperatures of up to 110 degrees Fahrenheit and down to 30 below in winter. That sounds perfectly suited for the Great Plains. Because it is. So the killing of the buffalo happened in the 1870s primarily. In the 1860s, it was settlers kind of just doing their own thing and killing buffalo. But in the 1870s is when the government started initiatives to exterminate the buffalo. 10 years later, in the winter of 1885 to 86, a devastating cold front hit the plains, and it nearly wiped out all of the cattle. And the next year, the same thing happened. Here's a quote from the book. Cowboys said they could walk along fences north of the Canadian River for 400 miles and never step off a dead animal. That is how many cattle died during that winter. Grasslands covered 21% of the United States and Canada. Removing the buffalo and removing the indigenous population was devastating to this region. In Texas alone, grassland covered 2/3 of the state, and there were 470 native species of grass. If you're thinking, why don't we just reintroduce the buffalo? Well, everywhere is fenced. These animals need to roam free. I'm a firm believer in the Land Back Initiative and movement, and I would love to see the buffalo repopulated in these areas. It didn't really go away because of any of our efforts. The drought simply ended. Now, when the drought ended, Hugh Bennett's soil conservation program was able to form 3 grasslands in the Great Plains, and so far that has prevented a catastrophe of this size from happening again. However, major dust storms did return in the 1950s during a brief drought and in the 1970s. They just were nothing even close to the ones experienced in the 30s. Here is a direct quote from the book. The High Plains never fully recovered from the Dust Bowl. After more than 65 years, which was when this book was published, some of the land is still sterile and drifting. Hugh Bennett estimated that white American farmers did 10,000 years worth of damage in around 1 decade to the land. So we were warned in 3 different phases not to turn this land into farmland. The first time we were warned was by the indigenous tribes of this region. The indigenous folks in this region were typically nomadic, following the buffalo as their way of life. And they knew the only way to survive on this land was to be nomadic and to allow the grasslands to be what they were. And remember the video with the locust problem? Well, one of the things that the indigenous folks did in this region were controlled burns. And this would kill a lot of the larvae that we were talking about. Those things were not happening once they left. And as we know, control burns also provide fertilizer for future plants. One of the huge ways we were warned was from Sitting Bull, the Lakota leader. Sitting Bull prophesied that if you remove the indigenous people from this land, the land and the sky will take revenge on you. Wow, did that come true. This prophecy was so feared that later Sitting Bull's nephew, One Bull, would write to the University of Oklahoma and said, if you give us back the things you stole from us, because several things were taken as memorabilia, if you give us back the things you stole from us, particularly a medicine bag, I will try to reverse the prophecy. This book does not go into detail whether or not the University of Oklahoma complied, but I'm going to go ahead and guess they did not. The second way we were warned was by cowboys. So once the buffalo were gone and this land was now occupied by millions of cattle, there was a huge ranch called the XIT Ranch. It was absolutely the largest ranch at the time. We're talking it was states wide. Now, these cowboys were of every race. There were white, black, Mexican cowboys, and these cowboys began to also really know this land. When prospectors started to come out there and say, hey, I think I want to plant corn here, they said, don't do that. Do not do that. And they meant because this land cannot handle it. But the prospectors were saying, you have special interest in telling me no because you want cows here. And they said, no, we do want cows here, but do you think we've not tried to grow things here? Don't do that. The third time they were warned was by early prospectors who came out here and said, what was I thinking? This is not built for this. I'm going home. We honestly could not have been more thoroughly warned. And still, capitalism knocked at the door. Our leaders during the First World War did not care. They said, go do it. And we did irreparable damage to that area of the country still to this day. So from like 1880 to maybe 1910, these snake oil type get-rich-fast land developers were going out to the Dust Bowl and purchasing hundreds of acres of land. When they got to the land, before purchasing, they knew immediately. They were like, there's no water here. How would a town be able to survive? Oh well, I'm buying it anyway. It's cheap and I don't care what happens after I leave. Cheap or sometimes free. Now, if you've ever been caught in a meeting with a timeshare salesman, this might sound familiar. But they would provide free train tickets from major cities out to this land that they purchase. And once you got there, they would have this picturesque Disney-type set on display for the smoke and mirrors of how great this town is going to be. Now, again, if you purchased a plot of land with a loan anywhere from 1880 to probably 1910, you were going to be able to pay it off. The wheat boom during World War I was very profitable, and many farmers got very wealthy off of this. There was one woman who was making as much money as Babe Ruth yearly. But if you bought your farm during World War I, during the wheat boom, these wheat prices did not hold up after the war. And these are the people who were defaulting on their loans when the stock market crashed. Now, when the stock market crashed in 29, the whole nation slowly descended into hunger, except for people in the Dust Bowl. And this is because the drought didn't hit until 1932. So from 1929 to 1932, we were still producing wheat at a wartime capacity. But after 29, the dollar really had no value, and therefore nobody could afford to ship the wheat out from the Dust Bowl into these cities. Years worth of wheat was sat on a platform in every train station where it typically would have been shipped out. Literally sat there. Silos were completely full. Families in the Dust Bowl were like, I guess we're having wheat product for every single meal. There were people burning wheat and corn in the Dust Bowl because it had more value as a fire source than it did for food. The drought, of course, changed all of that because not only were we not able to produce wheat at a wartime capacity, farmers weren't able to produce almost any wheat. Now, when people started to default on their loans, these foreclosures were being overseen by the local judge. And this was miserable for the local judge because he knew these people personally. These were small towns, small counties. So he was having to take the homes and property of his neighbors and his personal friends. This actually became extremely dangerous for these judges. Eventually, the farmers unofficially kind of unionized. And many times this became violent for the judges, where the farmers would literally kidnap them and threaten their lives. There were several instances where their lives were almost taken. And honestly, the sheriffs during this time were really not on the side of the judge either. The police force was very different back then. It was not as militarized. When I say sheriff, I'm talking one guy, maybe two, maybe three. And again, these are all his friends and neighbors. The sheriff was also miserable going to work every day, watching this happen. Now, when these judges took these properties, they would go to auction. And one of the other ways the farmers fought with an unofficial union was to go, okay, okay, then we're going to go to the auction and refuse to bid anything more than a dime on all of these properties. And it worked. For about 6 months, it worked. Farmers were buying back their neighbor's property for a dime and handing it back to the original owner. And the judge couldn't say anything because technically that's a legal sale. Eventually, though, new regulations were passed and these loopholes that the farmers found were closed. So it wasn't only women. I don't love the way that I phrased that in the video, but but it did disproportionately affect women, and the author does go into detail about why. And that is because women were doing 2 to 3 times more work than men to keep their children from dying and starving, and to keep their homes clean and sanitary for their whole families. And there were a lot of examples of men either abandoning their families or being gone so long because they were trying to look for work because their families were starving. This affected men as well. But in men, you typically saw them go into a very deep depression and not leave their dugout homes, spiral into alcoholism, or truly just wander off and abandon their family, not even from a place of abandonment, but from a place of losing it. The examples of people walking around town and truly in a circle, that's why they classified it as a new mental illness, like truly just walking in a circle and speaking to themselves, were all young women. I think they were trapped. A lot of the times the women were being forced to stay in this area by men who really wanted to still give this land a go. This mental illness did not only affect women, but stress can send you into psychosis, and the women had an unnatural amount of stress on them. So we've gotten to the topic I've been trying to avoid because I don't even want to talk about it. It's just so disturbing to me. Not only did this catastrophe contribute to the insect population doing very strange things, but the rabbits had nowhere to go. And by the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, they were ravaging cities. They had nothing to eat, so they were trying to do the same thing we were, which is survive. And of course, anything that humans would try to grow, the rabbits would try to eat. They became a huge problem to an already starving population. So what was the solution people came up with? Something the author calls rabbit drives. This is where people would gather by the thousands in some sort of fairground or a field, and they would create a human chain around the perimeter of the field, normally backing up to a fence. So the idea was the chain would push the rabbits in a concentrated area up against the fence, and slowly the chain of people would close in on the perimeter and begin bashing the rabbits with some sort of clubbed weapon. Baseball bats, farm tools, kind of whatever you could get your hands on. And the rabbits would panic and scream. Yeah, you get the picture. You see why I didn't want to talk about this? And this would take place for most of an afternoon. So they would start early morning and it would take all afternoon to kill several thousand rabbits. And I mean several thousand. In the book, he says up to 6,000 in one afternoon. Now, there was some effort to butcher these rabbits and send them into the city because, as we know, the whole country was kind of starving at this point. But rabbits are small, so butchering them takes a lot of work and storing them is not very efficient. They don't keep very well, so it only happened some of the time. Locals did eat these rabbits, but a lot of the time these rabbits were left dead and dying in a field for the vultures to eat later. This became hugely popular. It was like a weekly event, kind of like going to the rodeo or going to a football game. It spread throughout the entire Dust Bowl and people really looked forward to it. I don't know, man, it was a gruesome time. The Dust Bowl primarily impacted all of the Midwestern states and some of the southern states. So Kansas, Nebraska, Arkansas, Texas, Illinois, Indiana, the Dakotas, you get the picture, some of Wisconsin. And to be honest, all of the surrounding states were impacted at different times as well because the dust, as I've discussed, was blowing all over the country. But there was one part of the country who got the worst of it for all 7 years, and that's the Llano Estacado. In Spanish, this is translated as the Staked Plains, and it's called this because it is so flat and featureless that early settlers had to drive stakes into the ground in order to understand where they were. Otherwise, they would just get lost. Early settlers actually compared it more to an ocean than to land because that is how featureless it was. In any direction, it all looked the same. No water, no trees, nothing. Tall grass. This region is in eastern New Mexico and northwestern Texas. The panhandle of Oklahoma was also severely affected. This area of the country was quite literally the last to be colonized because these settlers feared this land so much. The tribes in this area of the plains were very unique in the fact that they had already been dealing with Spanish colonizers for 300 years before the English ones came from the East Coast. So they were not trying to negotiate, and I don't blame them. So explorers feared it for 2 reasons. 1, the tribes there were hostile towards settlers for good reason. And 2, it was easy to get lost in this area area. And if you got lost, there were very limited resources to survive. It was also hard to track where you had even come from because the grass covered up wagon trails within 2 days of the wagons passing through. For those reasons, this was some of the only land still available to settlers to grow wheat for World War I's The Wheat Will Win the War initiative. I will be covering this region of the country even more extensively with the next series I'll be doing on the book Empire of the Summer Moon, which I already have mixed feelings about, but I'm going to be covering it regardless. The governor of Oklahoma before and during the Dust Bowl was an extreme racist. His name was Henry David Murray. He went by the nickname Alfalfa Bill. Now, Alfalfa Bill did not only hate black people, he actually hated Jews way more. He thought black people had some morals, and he thought Jews were completely moralless. He actually won the election in Oklahoma running on a campaign that he called the 3 C's. Corporations, carpetbaggers, and a racial slur for black people that I'm not going to say here. He blamed black people and Jews for everything that was wrong in Oklahoma, and he immediately heavily segregated the state, saying that black people should only be kept in proper jobs, factories, or farms. Here is a quote from the book. "Blacks were inferior to whites in all ways," Murray said, "and must be fenced from society like quarantined hogs." President Theodore Roosevelt forced Murray to remove the segregationalist clause in the Oklahoma Constitution, and he was absolutely furious. He could not stand the Roosevelt family. Alfalfa Bill actually ran for president at the same time Theodore Roosevelt's 5th cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, ran for president, and Alfalfa Bill said that the Roosevelts were secret Jews who were hiding their ancestry. He completely crashed out over the Roosevelt family. He was so furious when FDR won that he literally changed parties forever, permanently. Now, something really common at this time was to train hop. So to jump on a train, travel city to city, and try to find work. If you were caught doing this by a police officer, the punishment was 4 months hard labor in a chain gang. That's 4 months if you were white. You were not supposed to hop off of a train at all if you were black. If a black person was caught train hopping, the judge in that area did whatever they wanted, pretty much. There is one really horrible story he tells in the book of 2 young men. I'm not even sure if they were train hopping. They could have had a destination, but they ran into a very bad dust storm, and they saw a room in the train station that was open. They were also starving because it was the Great Depression. This room had some food in it, so they did what any person would do. They closed the door to avoid the dust storm, and they took some of the food that was in there. Not all of it, but they took some bites. Well, they were caught, and the judge who they were sent to was extremely racist. He made them dance. He made them dance in the courtroom for all of the people in there's entertainment. And for months and months and months, these men were locked in a cell for the crime of avoiding a dust storm and eating a piece of bread. I don't even know what it was. In The Worst Hard Time, Timothy heavily features a town in Texas called Dalhart. And there was a sign on the edge of town in Dalhart that said, "Black man, don't let the sun go down on you here." So these were sundown towns. These were extremely unsafe places for black people to be. Now, in a prior video, you heard me say that the unemployment rate was 25%. That, again, should have had an asterisk by me. It was 25% if you were white. If you were black, the unemployment rate was 50%, sometimes 60. If you went to a job site in the 30s during the Depression, there were often notes posted up that said, quote, "No jobs for N-words until every white man has a job." In 1935, FDR sent out an executive order opening up his job initiatives to all races. The treatment of black folks in the Dust Bowl is just another example of settlers bringing black folks to a place to perform hard labor for very little money, and then getting angry with them for being there. I've gotten several comments for me calling out the fact that white farmers caused the damage in the Dust Bowl, because that is true. By this point in American history, black folks were master gardeners. This is part of the reason the Tulsa race riots happened. They were master gardeners. They were figuring things out that other people were not. If it's any consolation, Alfalfa Bill was essentially blacklisted from politics because he crashed out on a little kid at one of his rallies. The little kid spoke up for FDR, saying that he was helping the region, and he called him a little worm or something, a little ground worm, and he was like pointing at him and screaming at him, and he never recovered. I went down a huge rabbit hole about the Volga Germans when I was reading this book. Timothy Egan actually covers a lot of their stories and history in the US in this book. And although in my initial video I revealed that they're kind of credited with bringing over the invasive tumbleweed, or what he calls the Russian thistle, he also credits them with bringing over one of the only wheat strains that did relatively well in the Great Plains, when the Great Plains had enough rain to sustain it. I believe the strain was called Russian Red. He also credits the Volga Germans for why Americans take Christmas so seriously. Apparently, the Volga Germans did not play about that holiday, and it was a month-long celebration that they insisted on celebrating. So why were there Germans in Russia in the 1700s and 1800s? Because of Catherine the Great. Despite being one of Russia's most famous rulers, Catherine was German royalty. She married into the Russian family. And Catherine was sharp. She was extremely smart. But Catherine was having a problem in the south of Russia. And that problem were the indigenous tribes that border modern-day Mongolia and Kazakhstan. Now, this problem was similar to the American problem, where settlers were pushing west and indigenous tribes did not want them there. Would we call that a problem or a request? But regardless, Catherine wanted to populate this area. And she thought, Russia needs Europeans. They're so classy. They're such hard workers. They're such great farmers. And she appealed to all of Western Europe to come to Russia. She said, you'll have freedom of religion, you'll have freedom to speak your own language, you'll have tax-free land for X amount of years. And most of Western Europe was like, I don't want to move to Russia. What? But the Volga Germans were really, really desperate at the time she was making this offer because of the 7 Years' War that happened in Germany. They were battered, beaten, and very poor. They had nothing to lose. Now, I should say, she offered this up to all of Western Europe, unless you were Jewish. What's new? So that freedom of religion had a major asterisk. I'm sure she also would not have accepted Muslims. To be honest, she kind of put these Germans in danger. Like I said, those tribes did not want that region occupied by Europeans. They were raided several times. Timothy Egan goes into detail about one of the worst ones. It's very gruesome, trigger warning. But Catherine did protect them government-wise, so these Germans did thrive there under her rule. However, once Catherine died, the men that followed her did not give a hoot about these Germans. Slowly over time, their rights were being stripped away. They were no longer allowed to speak German. They had all these new religious rules. They had to start paying heavy, heavy taxes. And worst of all, Russia started drafting them in their wars. I don't think so. So the Volga Germans were like, I've heard of this place called America. Can't be worse than here. Let's go. And he tells one really crazy story in the book about a specific Volga named George. George was on a boat on his way to America when they hit an off-season hurricane. And in this storm, the mast of the boat snapped, but did not fully snap. So it was literally dragging their boat in a circle and sinking them. And it got so bad that the captain said, say your prayers. We're going down. Today is the day we die. I'm so sorry. This is when a young man that George only remembered by the name of Catholic Boy bravely said, tie a rope to me and give me a saw. I'm putting that mast into the ocean. They worked together, tied a rope to him, gave him a saw, and he went to work. His hands went numb and began to bleed from blistering, but it worked. And he sawed the mast off into the sea, and he saved them all. Now, with no mast, it was extremely difficult to get to their destination. It took them 2 additional months to arrive in New York, and when they arrived, their ship had been marked lost at sea. They had no food when they arrived, and many of them were desperately ill. But in 1891, George set foot in New York City. As I mentioned, the Volga brought over a strain of wheat that really thrived in the Great Plains, and was really the only strain of wheat that thrived there when there was water. And so really, the wheat would win the war was aided almost entirely by these Germans. Yes, Woody Guthrie wrote the song Dusty Old Dust in his head in Pampa, Texas in April of 1935 during the worst of these storms, which is now known as Black Sunday. He was hunkered down in a home with several people on the floor with a rag over his mouth to breathe, and the dust was so bad even inside the home that he could not see who was next to him. He could only hear. And he started to have a song in his head, and he became one of our most famous folk writers, including writing the song This Land Is Your Land, which is actually political commentary. Like, now it seems like a touching song to us, but it's satire. He was a leftist throughout all of his life and lived through the Dust Bowl in several of the worst places you could experience it. Ken Burns made a fantastic miniseries on the Dust Bowl that you can watch on PBS and I believe Amazon Prime. This is Tulip. She's joining me today. But the documentary that I want to highlight is called The Plow That Broke the Plains, and it was made by Per Lawrence during the Dust Bowl. Now, Per had never made a film before, but he had this idea to tell the story about the Dust Bowl as it was happening, and he wanted to go into how this happened. So really, it's a documentary about the plow that I was referring to. He tried to get Hollywood funding for this film for years, and nobody would bite. until finally he got a backer in the US government. And this is the only documentary funded by the US government intended for commercial use during peacetime. So if you know anything about America, it is almost constantly at war. And this is the only documentary the government ever funded during peacetime. When Hollywood found out that the documentary was being produced by the government, they flipped out. The studio heads did not want the government affecting their ability to make money on their art form. They tried everything to prevent this film from being made, all to no avail. This film went forward. Now, not only is it good that this film was being made from a historical standpoint, but also Pear's team was funneling money to the Dust Bowl in making it. He was paying people like $25 for 2 hours of work, which was normally like 2 months worth of pay back then. People in the region were ecstatic to help him, and actually one of the most famous images from the film is of an old-timey cowboy plowing the field with a horse-drawn plow. And this man's name was Bam White. Bam White is the same old-timey cowboy I referenced in the Locust story, and the image of Bam plowing the field became famous worldwide. The score was also made by a man named Virgil Thomas, and Virgil was from Missouri, so his heart was really in this region, and therefore he put his whole back into that soundtrack. Check it out, it's free on YouTube. It's called The Plow That Broke the Plains. This is the exact point that Timothy Egan ends the book on. He talks about how rather than changing the model itself, which needs to be done, the government said we need to keep this amount of farmland in this area. How can we make that happen? So they sent a series of pumps and pipes all the way down to the Ogallala Aquifer underground. And this is our largest body of underground fresh water in the whole US. He describes it like a sponge underground that spans from Texas all the way to South Dakota. It's absolutely massive. However, the problem lies with the fact that we are depleting it 8 times faster than it can replenish. And he says that it goes down by 1.1 million acre feet a day. That is 1.1 million acres a foot deep of water. That's larger than my brain can comprehend. So to clarify, this land can hold small amounts of gardening. It's not meant to sustain these giant corporate mega farms that decimate millions of acres of land. We actually need to rethink this worldwide. So it's not that the Plains tribes never planted anything there. It's just that it'd be more described like gardening, and they had more sustainable practices to do this gardening. This model is not sustainable. He also details about how these subsidies that FDR set up for small farmers, okay, small poor farmers, to keep them in business for feeding the nation, they are now abused by these mega corporate farms. And these subsidies go to farms that benefit the politicians the most. So they're like political subsidies. And we're talking billions of dollars a year going to these giant corporate farms just in subsidies from tax dollars. Now, I want to make some corrections that the indigenous folks in my comments have taught me. These are things I did not learn from this book or the book I'm reading right now, Empire of the Summer Moon. These books were both written by non-indigenous people. I described the Plains tribes as being mostly nomadic, and I've learned that that's not accurate. As we know, nomadic means constantly on the move, and I have learned that that's really not true. It's more migratory. So they would move and migrate with the seasons to different locations. Sometimes those were semi-permanent locations because they need the earth to replenish with the seasons. It's all about giving the earth time to replenish, just like this aquifer. So my apologies to all the Great Plains tribes. Thank you so much for being kind about teaching me this. I also want to say that in my video where I'm describing how we got to the Dust Bowl, the first time that I reference the indigenous folks being displaced from that region, I say they left. The second time in that video, I say removed. They did not leave on their own accord. That was their home for centuries. They were removed. So I just want to clarify that one I did know. I just did not use the correct language in that video, and I apologize. Now, another thing the indigenous folks taught me in my comments is that a lot of the tribe names I'm using, which again, I'm summarizing a book, so I read this, but a lot of the tribe names I used are derogatory, which that one is blowing my mind. Why are we using these terms if they're derogatory? So going forward, when I summarize the book I'm reading now, Empire of the Summer Moon, I'm going to be using the tribe names that the tribes identify with. That's like common sense. I can't believe I'm reading books that have been researched and they're using derogatory names. Not to shade Timothy Egan, because I still think this is a 5-star book, but I feel like that's a little careless. Go check it out, Wine and Crime Podcast. I just listened to their whole episode on the Dust Bowl, and it was hilarious. Obviously, the Dust Bowl isn't funny, but their reactions to how horrible it was were. I thought this would be a good time to cover some of the crimes that Timothy Egan highlighted that were committed during the Great Depression in the Dust Bowl. So today we're going to talk about scammers. This was a very difficult time to be alive, and people were desperate to do anything for money. But the most egregious of these scams that he talks about made me literally throw my book across the room. The Folkers family of Boise City, Oklahoma. It's spelled Boise, but it's pronounced Boys. Fred and Catherine were struggling financially just like everyone else, and to cope and take the edge off, Fred Folkers loved a glass of corn whiskey. Hey man, I get it. But in 1931, so 2 years after the financial collapse, Fred started to get these intense stomach pains every time he drank. Catherine begged him to go to the doctor, but the problem is there weren't a lot of doctors around. As I've described, this is not an ideal place to live, and doctors are kind of privileged. They had the option to go work in cities. But Catherine comes home one day and says, oh my god, we're in luck. There's a new female doctor in Boise City. So Fred goes to see her to appease his wife, and immediately the doctor diagnoses him with stomach cancer. The couple is devastated. That's almost a certain death sentence in the 30s. There's not a lot of cancer treatments available. But not to worry, this doctor has invented a cure for cancer. How coincidental. All Fred has to do is stay in her hospital for 2 weeks because she has invented a salve that she needs to apply with a bandage every day. Okay, now comes the next problem. How the heck are we going to pay for that? We are flat broke. The doctor said, I don't know, sell something. Girl, sell what? The air? But luckily, Fred has a secret stash of money that he never put in the bank. Fred and Catherine give this doctor every last penny they have. After 2 weeks of treatments, Fred comes home, and what do you know? He feels better. He's cured. Yeah, a couple of weeks later, his appendix burst. He had to be rushed to a doctor in Texoma, Oklahoma, and that doctor saved his life. Of course, Fred and Catherine go back to this doctor in Boise City. What do you know? She's skipped town. They can't confront her because she's nowhere to be found. When I tell you I was disgusted reading that, like I know times are bad, but that is just so low. Another scam I wanted to highlight were rainmakers. So apparently there's this ancient theory that dates back to the 1st century AD when Plutarch observed that rain always followed military battles. So it was believed that aerial bombing could trigger rainfall. My eternal enemy Napoleon also believed this, and apparently he would fire cannons into the sky between him and his attackers to muddy up the fighting ground for them. In the late 1890s, Congress actually approved funds to test this theory in Texas, and these tests were done by a guy named Dyrenforth. With government workers looking over his shoulder, Dyrenforth could not produce one single drop from the sky even though he was firing dynamite into it. This poor guy from then on was known as Dry henceforth. Ouch. Another person who became obsessed with this theory in the 1910s was a man named C.W. Post. That's the freaking Post cereal guy. Cereal Man was obsessed with aerial bombing theories. He ordered his ranch hands to build a kite that could hold 2 pounds worth of dynamite. And he tested this theory 2 times. Once in 1910, when the kite was going up to the sky, it started to rain before the dynamite even went off. Failure. In 1911, he sent his kite up again. The dynamite exploded, and absolutely nothing happened. He was still obsessed with the theory, but unfortunately 2 years later he died, and therefore could not test it anymore. In the 1930s, this theory was once again revived, probably due to desperation. A man named Tex Thornton brought this to Dalhart, Texas, the town I've been focusing on through most of this series, and he collected $400 from townsfolk to make this theory happen. That's a lot of freaking money back then. And of course, yet again, explosives were sent into the sky, and nothing happened. So we know about the crimes of Prohibition, we know about bank robbers, we know about train robbers, but the thing that is not highlighted enough during this time period is scam artists, snake oil salesmen. They were very prevalent. So not only did you have to worry about starving and dust storms, but you also had to watch your back because anyone could be lying to you for $1. Thanks again for Wine and Crime for shouting me out. Check out their podcast. I absolutely loved it. The Great Depression was not amplified by the average American rushing to the bank and grabbing all of their money out of their bank account. The Great Depression was worsened because wealthy bank investors had the banks go into the average American's savings accounts and pull money out of them. They saved themselves by reaching into our bank accounts and paying themselves when they went broke on the stock market. So yes, the stock market crashed, but only 3% of Americans owned stocks at that time. The average American did not go broke because of that. The average American was a farmer. The average American had money in their savings accounts, and the average rich asshole went broke because the stock market crashed. So they put their grubby little hands into our savings accounts. The banks let them because everyone who ran the banks also owned stocks and were also broke. They reached into our bank accounts to pay themselves. And wow, it's kind of relevant to right now. All right, y'all, before I get myself in trouble, I'm not a financial advisor, but I can read. So here's the direct quote from Timothy Egan's The Worst Hard Time from page 73. Banks had gone on their own speculative binges, reaching into people's savings accounts to make millions in interest-free loans available to bank officers. Translation: the bank officers went broke when the stock market crashed because they invested their money in the stock market, so the banks gave them permission to bail themselves out using our grandparents' and great-grandparents' money.